About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
And this is Noetic Moments, where we explore the field of research that discovers what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. I'm Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness, cybernetics, and anthropology, and through this series of programs, I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research, and I'm explaining some of their ideas and experiments. I also explore relevant news items and answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org. In the world of medicine and psychology, consciousness is defined as being awake and aware, knowing what's going on around us. The field of Noetics, though, defines consciousness as much more than that. The profound human experiences that shape our lives, the processes and products of mind that are in our awareness and outside of it, that are subconscious. And ultimately, it appears, based on our research in Noetics, that consciousness is what connects us all. So far in this series, we're on show number 33. We've looked at Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung's ideas about mind from the early 20th century, the first scientists trying to understand what was really happening, and they defined that most of what happens in the mind is outside our normal awareness, is in fact unconscious. Charles Tart came in through the 60s based on all the work that was going on after Jung and Freud, and he described a variety of states of consciousness. And Julian Jaynes came in and suggested that our experience of consciousness is somehow related to the split between the right and left hemispheres of our brain. We also looked at some of the field models of mind that have been developed. Kurt Lewin in the 50s and Rupert Sheldrake in the 80s through the 2000s, and others trying to explain how it is that mind affects and is affected by body and other things faster than nerve signals can travel. Which, of course, brought up how quantum mechanics relates to consciousness as described in the work of David Bohm, Dana Zohar, and Amit Goswami. And since one of the qualities of quantum states is that in the energy form they are universal, we looked at the concept of a global brain or noosphere, as described by Peter Russell, Teilhard de Chardin, and the global mind described by Ervin Laszlo. The field of transpersonal psychology emerged to apply some of these understandings in therapy, as well as to extend the research. And the state of coherence became something that people were focusing on, particularly at the Heart Math Institute and other places, a state in which the heart, the mind, and the emotions are all in alignment. We then explored some of the experimental results that support these new ideas about consciousness and extend them. For example, we saw that there is evidence for telepathic communication between two people, experiments in which mind affects matter, and the experience of what is called clairvoyance or remote viewing. We talked about the different states of consciousness we operate in through the day, and we explored frequencies and how we can move into higher and lower frequencies of vibration patterns in the brain and in the heart. We used the work of Penny Pierce, the study of cymatics, and the water crystal experiments of Masaru Emoto and others to help us understand that, which led us to look at the healing process and the role that consciousness and energy flows play in the body's response to threats and distress. And for the last several shows, we've been looking at the brain, the bridge between mind and body, which some scientists fewer and fewer every month, our thinking is the origin of consciousness. You can catch up on those past shows on the KXCR.net archives. You need to click on that little cloud up on the banner at the top of the screen for the past. And on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the clips and the books and authors that I mention in the show. Now, as I said, we've been looking at the brain for several episodes now, how it functions and how it works as the receiver-transmitter between mind and body, making possible our various sensations as we have mental experiences. Today, I want to introduce a topic that's been in the news a bit lately, and we will talk about that when we get to that segment. But the interest is increasing on how various substances affect the brain and its function as the receiver-transmitter of the field of mind that we each are constantly experiencing and creating. Now, I've personally never chosen to use any mind-altering substances beyond a drink with friends now and then. I have, however, been anesthetized a few times, and I've had some pretty amazing trips, if you will, in the process. This last time, I was awakened early on in the process, and I was waking up and I was telling people all about the tesseract that I was in. The tesseract, like the movie Interstellar. But like most folks born after World War II, I have known folks who were exploring the use of various kinds of psychedelic drugs. And in fact, Willis Harman, who I worked with for several years and who was one of the early directors of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, was involved in some of the earliest experiments with LSD being conducted at Stanford University, which experiments, I believe, was the beginning of his journey from engineering to exploring consciousness, the nature of humanity, and the future. Because I don't use such things, I was frequently considered a safe person to pilot the journeys of folks who did, which is a fascinating journey in itself. And it turns out I have an innate empathic tendency that made it easy for me to track their experience, and sometimes it was pretty disturbing. Some of their experiences included things like distortion of the sense of time and their identity. Sometimes there would be alterations in their depth of perception. Occasionally, people would see things that were generally manufactured in their heads, or so it seemed from the outside. Many of them had a sense of euphoria or certainty. A lot of folks on these trips have distorted perceptions of the size and shape of objects, of movements, of color and sounds. Their touch shifts, and their body image shifts, and they often will see things in other people that others cannot see. All of these things have contributed to an ongoing interest and involvement with the use of these substances, and today there is a renewed interest among scientists in the ways that such mind-altering substances can assist in therapeutic processes. I'll let some of the researchers tell you about their work.
This is the default mode network, and as you might have guessed, it is your default functioning mode inside of your brain. That is a default functioning network of neurons in your brain that is largely responsible for your human consciousness and perception as well. Now, this network is active pretty much all the time. It's active anytime you're not engaged in a particular task. It's active when you're thinking about yourself, when you're thinking about other selves, when you are engaging in detailed memory recall and moral reasoning, when you are giving judgments and labels and evaluations to yourself and to others and, to society and all that. And whenever you think about the future or the past as well. So you tell me how often you use this network. It's active pretty much all the time. And the thing with this network is that it's active by default. And after the ages of 6 6 to 12, it gets so reinforced in your brain that you're not really able to think outside of this neurological network. You're not really able to just go ahead and say, oh, I'm going to avoid that now, and I'm going to use my, extra neurological potential. You just know how it happens. Because with age, we tend to just fall within these networks. And whether we like it or not, they will process stuff for you and for me and for us in a specific way, whether we like it or not. So why am I telling you all of that? Well, because of this loopy automatic network, we are kind of the way we are. And psychedelics have been found to have an absolutely profound effect on this network in these two brain areas. And we are looking at psychedelics today. What are psychedelics? Well, first of all, psychedelic is a word, it's a concept. It's derived from ancient Greek. Psych means mind or soul, and delum means to show or to reveal. So that translates into mind, mind revealing, or commonly used as mind expanding. So there are many, many, many different substances that could be, classed as psychedelics out there. And I want to stress, really put emphasis on something here. They are a completely different category of things in terms of qualitative experience compared to anything else you might have, come across on the street, or you might have heard of from your friends, smoking ganja and maybe taking some cocaine and ecstasy. This is completely different. This is a whole separate category of things. And I'm going to focus particularly on one specific kind of them today. These are called the serotonin receptor agonists. LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, and DMT, also known as ayahuasca.
That was Simeon Kremenchev in a TED Talk talking about the way the brain normally functions. That is, there is a path, a neuronal path and network that gets formed during the years 6 to 12 that is pretty much the network that the mind has to follow all of the time for the rest of one's life, unless one has major traumatic experience or one has the experience of what he just called magic mushrooms. So psychedelic drugs, hallucinogenic drugs, are ones that bring the mind more fully into the brain, is one way to talk about them. Here's another experimenter with her comment.
In our study, we were originally looking at the effect of psilocybin on the patient's brains. So it makes the brain go from rigid to flexible, hyperconnected. You could say that it unlocks the brain. So in our study, we did these brain scans and we could see this increased flexibility, and we also included a symptom measure, so we could see that depression symptoms were going right down. But that doesn't tell the full story. We wanted to know from patients, in their own words, what was happening, what was the psilocybin doing? So we interviewed them all 6 months after the dose, and we analysed the interview transcripts and came up with 2 themes about what psilocybin was doing. But before I get onto those themes, I think maybe I should clarify what a psychedelic experience is. So psychedelics allow the unconscious mind to become conscious. Important material that has been built up over the course of life, but that has been pushed out of sight where you can't see it, emerges. It's kind of crumpled clothes that you push to the back of your wardrobe, and it emerges, it comes out. You don't just see it, you embody it. Memories, emotions, pain, love, grief, whatever has been hidden emerges and demands you feel it. It can be incredibly painful and incredibly beautiful. Patients in our study described overall having 3 main types of experience. So firstly, visiting past traumas. Secondly, having insights about your life, negative patterns and how to change them. And thirdly, these experiences of harmony and connection and unity. And sometimes they would have all 3 experiences in the course of one dosing session.
Psychedelic, then, meaning mind growing or expanding or revealing, apparently have the capacity to unlock that one network that adults go through over and over and over again and access other parts of the brain. In fact, the diagram that most of these research presentations have used shows a neural network that uses just little tiny lines, maybe let's say a dozen lines around the brain, connecting this part and that part and the other part. And then with the mushrooms having been taken or other psychedelic drug having been taken, there are maybe 100 lines around all over the brain, making connections in different ways. So this psychologist, Rosalind Watts at Oxford, has been working with a group of folks who are using mushrooms to help people get over depression. And what's happening is that network that they had been confined to was not allowing them access to parts of the mind. I have a saying that I often use: depression comes from repression. When we've told our body-mind system, no, we can't feel that, over and over and over again, it no longer is part of that neural network. And so we don't have access to it, but it's still generating the molecules of emotion that we learned about with the Candace Pert work weeks ago. So what these psychedelic drugs are doing in a treatment situation with a therapist is helping people to get access to those parts of their minds that have been repressed from their brains so that they can actually experience the emotions and move through them and move on with their lives. Kind of exciting research. Here's another researcher with some more comments on it.
In 1990, Dr. Rick Strassman, a psychiatrist who was trained during the era of psychedelic therapy and dreamed of being a psychedelic therapist, was able to re-engage in psychedelic research. He was encouraged by his supervisor to examine the drug dimethyltryptamine because the university would know what it was. Dimethyltryptamine is possibly a potent psychedelic known to humankind. It's used by shamans in South America to enter the spirit world. He was encouraged to do some small-scale blood studies just looking at the metabolism of the drug, but what he found far more profound were the participants' experiences. They reported being transported to parallel dimensions where there were entities communicating with them. Eventually, Strassman wrapped up his research because he felt it was unethical to be pushing people off this psychological abyss without knowing where they were going. But it was too late. He'd opened Pandora's box, and we subsequently have seen an explosion of psychedelic research, what's now been referred to as the psychedelic renaissance. So what have we learned? We've learned a lot about the brain. But what really excites me as a clinically trained psychologist is mounting evidence that psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies are effective in the treatment for people who don't respond to current therapies for a range of mental health conditions. So let's look at the evidence. We used to think that psychedelics turned on parts of the mind. We've now learned what it actually does is turn off a part of the brain called the default mode network. The default mode network is a series of neural pathways that connect certain areas of the brain together while preventing other parts of the brain crosstalking. It's active whenever you're in a wakeful state. It becomes more active when you engage in autobiographical narration, you know, that little voice in your head. And it becomes hyperactive when people experience depression and OCD. So what happens with psychedelics is it actually turns the default mode network off. So what does that look like? The picture you can see here is the brain not on psychedelics and the brain on psychedelics. See all the intercommunication and connectivity that's happening between parts of the brain that would never normally communicate. And it's been hypothesized that this is the reason that people experience creativity and have spiritual experiences when they take psychedelic drugs. But more importantly, it's been hypothesized that this increased communication and increased connectivity in the brain could help treat people who are treatment resistant with depression. Because with all this interconnectivity happening in the brain, perhaps they can overcome their entrenched beliefs and see the world from a completely different perspective.
That was Stephen Bright at a TED Talk in Australia, in case you didn't pick up on the accent. A clinical psychotherapist who was seeing how the use of these psychedelics could expand people's capacity to understand more of what is already going on in their minds because more of the brain is accessed, which leads to an improvement in the body-mind system. All right. Well, one of the contributors to this information and to this new interest is a book that came out in 1999 by an anthropologist from Switzerland, Jeremy Narby. It was called The Cosmic Serpent, DNA and the Origins of Knowledge. Now, Jeremy Narby is known as one of the people who has helped indigenous people in the Amazon basin claim their ancestral lands and have title to them under the legal systems in various nations of the Amazon basin. He tells us in the book, The Cosmic Serpent, that he came to understand what was going on when he was doing field research for his doctoral dissertation in anthroecology. He was looking at how the native people in the Amazon basin relate to the plants around them, how they use the plants around them, and how the different plants in different parts of the basin affected the cultures of the tribes. Now, the book, The Cosmic Serpent, came out well into Narby's career. And he says in the final chapters that he was going around the world explaining how important things were in the Amazon basin without ever mentioning some of the experiences that he had had as a field researcher. And some of those experiences included a couple of sessions with a psychedelic substance called ayahuasca, or as our Australian presenter described earlier, DMT. What Narby experienced with the ayahuasca was the opening of his awareness to what the plants around him were actually operating as. For example, in his very first experience, he describes having two huge snakes intertwine in front of him. And later he realizes those snakes are the DNA molecule, that he was inside the plant and the DNA in his mental world. It's a fascinating book, and his understanding of the anthropology, the ecology, and later understanding of the nature of the psychedelic experience really makes it a very useful tool for people who are trying to get a deeper understanding of the mind and the fact that mind is interconnected with all mind. It's just our brain that is limited, and that psychedelic drugs used appropriately with the appropriate guidance, whether an experienced master in the shamanic tradition or a therapist who's been trained in the use and dosages and the setting up of appropriate settings for them, all of these are necessary for an effective use of psychedelics in the human system. And that sound tells me it's time to look at what's going on in the news. Now, I chose today's topic not only because it's part of the understanding how the brain and mind interact, but because the use of various hallucinogens and psychedelics is in the news today. Not only has Oregon made psilocybins legal in therapeutic uses this past year, as of July 15, 2022, many cities, including Ann Arbor, Michigan, Denver, Colorado, Oakland, California, and Seattle, Washington, have passed measures that essentially decriminalize the use of psilocybin. Now, I keep referring to hallucinogens and psychedelics, and there are some very specific ones being looked at. Lysergic acid diethylamide is LSD, for those of you who grew up hearing that term. And that was the one that was developed in the 1920s. It tended to help women with post-birth issues and ended up being far more than that. And it was used experimentally by many researchers in many universities, and Timothy Leary, of course, is the most famous, along with the man who became Ram Dass, Richard Alpert, to help people understand its potential. However, because it became a street drug, it was declared illegal in 1967. Others that have been being used over the years, phencyclidine, also known as PCP or angel dust, ketamine, dizokilpine, MDMA, methyl and deoxymethamphetamine, which is ecstasy, and you can hear methamphetamine in there. So we know that without the appropriate controls could be a real problem. And then there are the mushrooms, the psilocybins, mescaline, and peyote as well from desert plants, and that Amazonian mixture of plant extracts called ayahuasca that is described in The Cosmic Serpent. As we heard in the studies earlier in today's show, the most promising uses for these substances include reducing depression and anxiety, but also reversing PTSD by giving people access to that block and undoing it that causes people to be stuck in a particular moment in time. These various medications used in therapeutic ways have helped to ease some of the symptoms of addiction. Now, there are adverse indicators which must be kept in mind by therapists, and we need to be aware these are not for recreational use. They need to be used in very carefully monitored situations. The adverse indicators have to do with the fact that almost all of these drugs tend to increase blood pressure. So if there are any cardiovascular issues or if someone is pregnant, they do not want to be using these. So as more cities and states make the use of these substances available for therapy, we're going to see some significant changes in therapeutic processes and, what I'm looking forward to, the well-being of those who are benefiting from a mind that is no longer quite so blocked from the body's experience. Well, that's it for today's show. The next time we get together, we'll look at more of the research being done in an attempt to understand what consciousness is, what it really does, and how we can experience life differently when we use it fully. We are out of time for today, but remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there's a list of the titles and other resources we refer to on the show, along with archived past shows, and where you can send me your comments and questions, which I will do my best to get answered the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here, and have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.